So I've gained a large number of subscribers in the last several weeks, and this has largely been around a video I made concerning Sargon of Akkad, the YouTuber, and why I feel that him and the rest of the people who call themselves cultural libertarians are more or less doomed in their attempt to fight against the hardline progressives, what some people oftentimes call social justice warriors. So I received a bunch of positive comments, but I think among the more negative comments, and certainly some of the most reasonable criticisms, pointed out that while I was able to give, I think, a somewhat cogent critique of Sargon, I did not really lay out a solution, or any way that really the problem of the hardline progressives could really be dealt with in our culture. And I think this is a very fair criticism, and although I'm not really ready yet to give a prescriptive analysis of what can be done to halt the ascendancy of the hardline progressives, I think we really do need to start looking at the progressive movement and ask ourselves why it has been so effective at taking over the culture. In fact, I'm fairly confident that when historians look back on our particular era of history, they'll really be chiefly concerned with the ascendancy of the left, not the various movements that oppose the left. The story of the last 7 decades, or probably the last 9 decades in the West, has been the slow takeover of the progressive perspective, both in Europe and America. And even movements like conservatism, neoconservatism, and paleoconservatism have just been reactions against that. The primary mover has been the left, and the progressive left in particular. The cultural libertarians, as represented by Sargon, are simply just the latest contenders to the ascendant progressive left, and given what we've seen so far, they're likely to share their predecessors' fate. So, taking into account the criticism and comments I've gotten from the last video on Sargon, well, I understand that I'm probably not ready to really postulate positive recommendations on what can be done about the ascendancy of the progressive left. I think I can make a video that might help people understand why it's such a cultural force, and why it's able to fight political battles with such different rules than all of the various political movements that have come up to oppose it. I'm sure people have noticed this before, but it seems to many that the left doesn't operate by the same rules that other political movements have operated under. It has Teflon plating, nothing sticks to it. And many things that would have been detrimental and perhaps even fatal to many other political movements, even large-scale political movements in the past, have not really impacted progressivism as it's been ascendant in the last 80 years. And it's funny because it seems that nobody really asks themselves why the progressive movement has been so resilient. Why has it been so robust and difficult to impede in really achieving massive changes in the culture and political environments of the West? I feel like it's almost as if the current enemies of progressivism don't want to associate themselves with the failed movements that have tried to oppose it in the past. They feel like they're going to jinx themselves. And I think this is a mistake because although I think the answers of what to do about the ascendancy of progressivism and how to push back on it are very, very difficult, I think identifying what really makes it a powerful and almost unstoppable political movement is quite easily done. Now, there are probably 1,000 ways to explain the ascendancy of the political and cultural left in the 20th and 21st centuries, but I think that the main dominance of the left really owes to one concept, a concept that has been discussed by economists, and one economist in particular, Nassim Nicholas Taleb. This is the concept called Antifragility. Now, Nassim Nicholas Taleb wrote an entire book on the concept of anti-fragility, and I'll try to summarize it here. Basically, the concept is that a group or movement that has an anti-fragile nature to it actually benefits from variation and disruptions that would ordinarily hurt other groups. Instead of getting damaged by adversity, the system incorporates it and becomes stronger from contact with it. It's sort of the Nietzschean anything that does not kill me makes me stronger, sort of the effect an immune system has, where every time it encounters a virus, it learns from it and becomes stronger. And you can even see it in concepts like the Borg from Star Trek, who every time they encounter some new weapon, immediately adopts that weapon, adapts to it, and becomes immune from its effects after the first interaction with it. And truly effective political systems, truly effective systems in general, have a component of anti-fragility, and so when you see them in action, they have this aura of invincibility, of inevitability. Resistance is futile because every single time they get disrupted, every single time something's done against them, they just become stronger, they learn from it. Now, Nassim Nicholas Taleb contrasted anti-fragility with several other concepts that look somewhat similar. Anti-fragility is not robustness, it's not simply resistance to attacks or change. Anti-fragility means that the system is actually in some ways benefited by them. Moreover, anti-fragility isn't really intelligent adoption either, or adaptivity through learning. Anti-fragility is supposed to be an unconscious component of an effective system, something that happens automatically and without necessarily some kind of learning going on behind it. And finally, a clarification is that no anti-fragility is absolute. Anti-fragility is limited to a certain range of things, and of course, no system is 100% anti-fragile. But with those caveats in mind, I think that when we look at the modern left, and really the left as it has existed through most of the 20th century, we're seeing an organization and really a system that is at its very base an anti-fragile system. Every single failure it experiences is really just a learning opportunity. It never really seems to be hurt by any of its setbacks. And I think two great examples of this can be seen in the progressive movement's relationship to the Black community and also to the gay community with the instance of HIV/AIDS. Now, I think probably the more famous example is the African American community, which in the early 20th century was a Republican moderate voting force that didn't really have a political alignment that was far left at all. This is also a time where, despite the massive amounts of racism against African Americans, Black family structure did not differ greatly from the rest of society. So, what happened? Well, in short, the dissolution of the Black family, which I would argue has been the primary source of problems in the African American community for most of the later half of the 20th century. This was largely brought about by the introduction of welfare and the advent of the sexual revolution, two projects of the left. And since then, and primarily because of the dissolution of the Black family, despite its massive detriment on the African American community, the African Americans will never again vote for a Republican Party, or at least a conservative Republican Party. The core of the conservative movement relied on having a nuclear family that would facilitate education, that would pass on values, that would allow people to intergenerationally share capital. And for a community that did not have this feature, the conservative movement, and therefore the Republican Party, would hold virtually no appeal. And thus, the progressive movement, by inflicting the biggest problem on the African American community, secured them as a very consistent voting base. They essentially were politically rewarded in the long run for one of the greatest social disasters in American history. A similar effect can be seen in the gay community with the AIDS epidemic in the early 80s. Now, once again, this problem was introduced into the culture largely by the sexual revolution and the existence of large-scale promiscuity inside urban communities. But even in the short run, the left really facilitated the spread of this disease by simultaneously refusing to identify homosexual promiscuity as the vector in which it was spreading, and also its refusal to close down and crack down on gay bathhouses, which was another way that the disease was spreading on a microcosmic scale. And what is the consequence of the AIDS epidemic? What do we remember culturally? Well, if you've seen any Hollywood movie about it, you think that the main reason why AIDS was a problem was because Ronald Reagan refused to acknowledge that it existed. Even though at that point, really, an acknowledgement by the executive branch really would have had very little to do with the spread of the disease, considering how little means people had of actually confronting it medically at that time. So again, both macrocosmic and microcosmic policy failures that resulted in a large amount of death that really originated from the left only resulted in a political benefit. The perception that the conservative movement had it out for homosexuals and didn't care about them dying. Once again, anti-fragility. But okay, so where am I going with this? I mean, largely I'm not telling anyone anything they don't already know, and it won't really behoove anyone to say, well, the leftist has this magical anti-fragility that causes all of their political setbacks to be actually political benefits in disguise. And of course, this gives this concept of anti-fragility this magical quality. But really, there is nothing magical about it, in my opinion. I think that fundamentally what causes this sort of anti-fragility, this sort of game where the left and the progressive movement can't really ever be held account for policy mistakes, is really derivative of its identity, not as a political movement, but as a cultural, and I hesitate to say, a religious movement. The left is fundamentally not the same kind of thing as the right, or really any other political movement that has ever opposed it, or really proposes policy inside a given culture. Now, I could list a number of reasons and number them like I usually do, but I think at this point what I'm going to do is use a graphic to illustrate what I think is going on here, to illustrate a model that would really help us think about how political discourse goes on, and how that's influenced by cultural changes in cultural discourse. Subsequently, I hope it'll become clear what I think the left is doing very, very differently from previous political movements, and why it's been so effective at establishing this persistent anti-fragility. Okay, and before people go to the comments to tell me that this model is simplistic, look, I get it. This is just a model for purposes of illustration. Hopefully it is helpful, but it does not encompass everything in reality. That being said, I think we can use it to effectively describe what's going on. So people who oftentimes talk about politics in some abstract sense oftentimes discuss a range of political opinions that are discussed at any given time. They view it as sort of a domain of possible policy positions you could take. In my model, we could represent this by a box. This is what some people call the Overton Window. Inside this box would be really every political opinion that could really be seriously entertained inside a given political system. The Republicans are going to ask for more military spending. The Democrats are going to ask for less, but the Democrats aren't going to ask to abolish the military, and the Republicans aren't going to ask for a first strike against a given country they don't like. And this sort of creates the natural political back and forth, Democrats saying taxes should be higher, Republicans saying taxes should be lower, and there's sort of the elastic effect that draws them to some kind of compromise, or maybe makes the conversation go back and forth, each side taking political setbacks as they introduce their policies and they either succeed or fail. And this is largely discussed and understood in political circles and circles of political science, and this is how we usually talk about an idea being under discussion or outside of the fray or outside of the mainstream. If the idea doesn't fall inside this box that is the window, then it's not really discussed, and the window shifts back and forth to allow new ideas in. However, there's a dimension to this discussion or an outer level that I think is very rarely a part of political conversations or part of political consciousness, and that is a similar sort of window or horizon that describes what is sort of culturally acceptable to talk about. These are mores and moralities and perceptions that really exist at a much more fundamental level than do perceptions concerning political acceptability or political feasibility of a given proposal. We can see this as sort of a cultural framework that exists outside the political framework and, in a sense, contains it. Just as the political framework of the Overton Window determines what's politically acceptable or politically feasible to discuss, the cultural framework controls essentially what is acceptable at a societal level, such that anything that's outside of the cultural framework is not only considered kooky or not really mainstream, but foreign and immoral and altogether deplorable, something that really does not need to be accepted by a society and is just seen as a faux pas or a taboo. This level is also called the cathedral by many people in the reactionary right, but we'll get to that later. This, in essence, is a much more fundamental way of looking at acceptability or discussability of a political issue. Take, for instance, our original example on taxes. Now, of course, we could say that taxes should be lower, taxes should be higher as sort of the framework for our current Overton window or our political framework, and someone advocating for, say, absolutely no taxes would be kind of a fringe type person that really wouldn't get a platform in the political framework, and someone saying that the government should confiscate all earnings and we should have a complete socialism, that's also sort of a fringe position. But in addition to that, we could imagine further expansions on the framework that you just would never hear inside polite society. For instance, if someone advocated not only 100% tax rate, but also that the government should organize and facilitate labor camps and should use forced labor to extract and control the movement of economic goods inside of the economy. Similarly, on the other end, you could imagine a sort of advocacy for a total destruction of all institutional control and return to sort of a primitivism and sort of the Fight Club Tyler Durden style anarchy as being something you just wouldn't hear inside polite society. Nobody is going to sit down to a conversation and dinner and have one of their guests advocate for the legalization of outright murder. And this really differentiates the things that are outside the political discussion from things that are just outside the cultural discussion writ large. I think this is a useful way to imagining discourse existing in our society. We can see both levels operate and understand how they really impact things inside a conversation, and there's different institutions that really exist inside each of these bubbles. For instance, inside the white political framework, we would have explicit institutions that we think about. We can think about actually interacting within our daily lives. So the political framework would control the discourse that would go on in political parties, that would be discussed in mainstream columnists and mainstream bloggers, and it would also be how we would organize personal conversations anywhere in public. This would be the kind of discourse we would have inside corporate America, inside school, inside any kind of the proper institutions that we have in our society. And as such, it would be very explicitly controlled. However, when we go on to the cultural framework, this encompasses a much broader range of political opinions. And as such, really, it's controlled and facilitated by very different set of things. These are controlled by subtle institutions that we don't think of as institutions, that are in the background, that sort of constitute the background radiation of everything. The religious fixtures, the societal ideas, the culture-wide ethics. These are things oftentimes, and not coincidentally, you hear complained about by social justice warriors and the radical left. But again, we'll get to that a little bit later. Now, of course, in these examples, I've created these spaces, these boxes, where it looks like you can move around a fair amount in either direction. One cultural sphere that you can move around in, it encompasses one political sphere, which you can also move around in. Of course, this isn't always the point. If we were to model, say, a totally authoritarian society, the political framework would have absolutely no ability to hold any contrasting views. And as such, the political framework would be totally consolidated into one point. Imagine this sort of like a medieval autocracy, where the only political will would be that of the king, who would be the sole sovereign, and no debate would really be brooked, whereas there still might be a cultural framework that would control the mores of society, which in, I guess, the medieval analogy would be sort of like the Catholic Church or Christianity, which would control what would be conceivable in the broader sense. To contrast this, we could see in a totalitarian system, really both the political order and the cultural social order would be the same actual box, regardless of how large or small that would be. Political decrees would become cultural decrees and vice versa, and thinking outside of the political reality would be a very, very difficult thing indeed. Here, perhaps the analogy would be Stalinist Russia or North Korea. The political order of the day would be the very reality of the culture itself, and there would be no distinguishing in between the two of them. But again, these are models, and you can see how in an ordinary functioning society, these two fixtures would be separate, and they would be places where discourse could actually be engaged in. So I think this model is really worth thinking about when we look at the transition between a more traditionalist order, the order that most humans lived under for the majority of history, and sort of the more modern liberal order that exists in most countries in the West. Now, as I said before in previous videos, the standard model for human organization was an authoritarian one, a sort of wide range of cultural mores that would control society, and then political power concentrated in one authority figure, or a very, very small set of authority figures. Now, of course, in Europe, starting really, I think, with the Christian era, but really culminating in the Enlightenment and post-Reformation eras, there was a need to sort of radically and broadly open up the political environment for debate. There were many, many political parties and many, many different political religions that needed to share a common society, share a common state. So the solution was essentially to have a more open political discourse, to have a range of political opinions which would be acceptable and debatable in the society. And whether that was governed ultimately by a single authority or whether that was governed by democracy, these political opinions would be governed and acceptable inside the broader framework. And society could shift back and forth based on individual battles and debates and power plays done inside some acceptable realm of legality. Now, again, I think the key misunderstanding in the history, or the understanding of the history of this process, is the fact that we left out the understanding of how the cultural framework was key in facilitating this change. Essentially, broad political debate and political movement are possible and perhaps even a very, very good thing, but they require the broader cultural framework to cooperate with this. Specifically, they require that political parties understand that there is a certain range of political actions that are unacceptable, and that political actors can be evaluated by standards outside of the political process itself. Briefly, I'll try to demonstrate these two principles. Now, if we have some kind of debate, either in parliament or in some kind of democracy or some kind of rival aristocracies that are pushing back and forth, there has to be an understanding, if there's not to be a complete collapse of society, that there's legal standards that control what these people can and can't do when they come into power. They can't come into power and then arbitrarily have their opponents executed for no reason whatsoever. They can't come into power and completely tear down the apparatus for which their opposition could even mount an opposing voice. Moreover, there needs to be some mechanism by which we judge the rightness or wrongness of political actors in this sphere. This can't completely go on in a vacuum. At the end of the day, in order for some kind of political order to make sense, at least when there's a sway back and forth, there has to be some way where we can say, politician X did a good job at procuring this social good. Politician Y did not do a good job at procuring this type of social good. And because of that, there can be political victories that actually help the society achieve its goals. This, of course, will not work if society can't agree on what's good and what's bad, and if the cultural framework is so weak that the political party itself can define what's good and what's bad, as in, say, Stalin or Mao. What's good in North Korea is largely what dear leader wants to be good, and if something happens, it is good. The culture has to stand in judgment of the doings and actions of politicians. The evaluation and judgment has to come from culture onto the political framework in order to work. On the other hand, politicians can't simply rewrite cultural fixtures. Otherwise, we end up losing the ability to adequately judge our politicians by any standards, and we end up in some sort of weird totalitarian system. Now, classically, there were safeguards that prevented political forces from really influencing the cultural framework that stood in judgment of them. I mean, starting in the post-Reformation, it was because this was mainly a religious fixture that was seen as too powerful to influence. But later, there were actual guards against having something like this happen in the form of the separation of church and state, and also in particular guards around teaching and formation. And here's where I finally circle around to the question at hand, the core anti-fragility of the left and progressive movement. Under this proposed model, the anti-fragility of the left is largely owed to the fact that it is not really a political movement, but rather a cultural one. It seeks not really political victories, but the ability to influence culture and rewrite what it means to have a political victory, to rewrite the rules that are used to evaluate what side has really won in politics and what it means to win in politics. And it's done this by directly attacking the controls people have placed upon political entities changing and modifying the culture. And here I think we can begin to identify three as sort of the common ways that it has done this and continues to do this. Alright, so first off, and the one that I think that everyone is sort of aware of in the anti-SJW community or the anti-progressive community online, is progressives and SJW's use of language. Now, language is sort of one of the most fundamental mechanisms that cultures use to discuss good things and bad things and to identify what are bad principles and what are good ones. And because of this, the constant modification of language for political purposes has been an enormous tool at accomplishing this. Now, I think this is such a big topic, it really requires one, if not two, of its own videos. But I think everyone's familiar of the common ways that language is modified for political ends, especially in the progressive movement. I mean, what does it mean to be racist in modern day America? Not what it meant in 1960s. And now we're even learning that certain political groups by definition can't be racist. The same thing is true for what it means to be a feminist, what it means to be a victim, what it means to have privilege. All of these words mean completely different things, and they were intentionally modified in their meaning in order to reposition the political landscape and create the perception that the enemies of the progressive movement essentially could not have a certain level of goodness or implicitly had some kind of evilness to them. And again, I think there wasn't existing controls on how language was manipulated in more traditionalist times. I'm thinking back to the 19th century. Now, in the 19th century, there was this idea of the staticness of language, the idea that language was some pristine thing that really had inherent and implicit beauty to it. This was sort of the motive for creating the Oxford English Dictionary, the total description of what English was in its entirety. It's also sort of what you can see in this Professor Higgins Pygmalion My Fair Lady perception that there was a correct, pristine, right way of practicing English. Language was proscriptive in a very, very real sense. Now, since the Victorian era, we've moved away from this understanding of language to the possibly more anthropologically correct view that language is in some sense descriptive and not proscriptive. But in this movement, in our understanding of language, we've really dropped a lot of guards when it comes to maintaining definitions of words and controlling what language actually means. And in that vacuum, a lot of malignant political entities have come in and have, I think, literally and intentionally tried to manipulate language for the purposes of advancing political causes and changing the culture in order to make the political cause commensurate with a cultural change. Now, in France, they've maintained this idea of sort of a prescriptive idea of the language. And I think this might be one of the main reasons why, although in France, radical leftism is quite popular in some minor sectors, it has yet to flow over to sort of the base supporting educational and political structures the way it has in the United States and Britain and the rest of the Anglosphere. The next barrier to really fall is that the left has now redefined what it means to have an identity in modern society. This is another thing that more traditionalist societies were very, very careful to create and cultivate. People have a hard time remembering this, but even in very, very free Western countries, nations spent an enormous amount of resources to make sure that citizens saw themselves first and foremost as members of the body politic, with other secondary identities being pushed to the wayside. Moreover, religious identity was facilitated, and nations and societies actively spent resources to make sure that the religious identity of their citizens worked in concert with their broader role in society as a citizen. And so, again, what has happened subsequent to that time? I think really what we've seen is Early in the project of the progressive movement, there was an all-out attack on identities, qua identities. You had people from the early existentialists on down to later communists really trying to undermine people's identities, their roles in the family, their roles in the nation, their roles as religious believers, and really replace them with nothing. Replace them with an understanding that individualism, qua individualism, was really the only thing real and everything else was simply put upon them by society. Subsequently, we see that in the later part of the progressive project, this has actually been supplanted. And now, instead of removing identities and leaving bare individualism, the left is now putting in play identities it feels will be ultimately helpful to its own political projects. It's encouraging people to see themselves as transgender, as genderqueer, as pansexual, as demisexual, as gender fluid, a variety of different identities that wouldn't have even existed in prior states, but that align them with the ultimate political project of the left and ally them against any of the more traditional modes of the state. Moreover, the left is perfectly willing to encourage and facilitate racial identification when that identification helps its broader political project. And this would have absolutely been controlled in previous societies because of its incredible danger to the broader cultural framework of society. Alright, and I think the final mechanism through which the progressive movement has really tried successfully to influence the cultural framework of Western society has been through historical narrative. Now, again, this probably could be another 1, 2, or even 3 videos, so I'll try to be brief here. But the left has utterly succeeded at controlling historical narrative, both in teaching and in presentation of history through the media. And again, it's done so largely by casting aspersions on the standard narratives that were put in place that defined culture previously, and then making sure that every single one of the historical narratives and stories that were brought up around the nation have really fallen away, and the only thing left to replace them is the narrative of the left. So I've done this with a variety of students and younger millennials that I've run into, but I've asked them to name a few heroes of history that they admire. And without exception, really the only people they can possibly think of are Martin Luther King, Gandhi, and maybe a few other people from the progressive feminist movement. That's an entire history that spans thousands of years. They can only name 3 people, and all of those people are very, very intimately linked to the progressive political project. And these are college-educated people. And the fact of the matter is really that the progressive historical perspective has been put in place that really the only heroes of history are the progressive movement. And so really all that's left over is the narrative of the political left. And as I said in previous videos, once you control the narrative, you basically control the arguments that can be had. So where does this really leave us, and how does this really manifest itself in the sort of core anti-fragility of the left? Well, I think through these mechanisms I just described here, you really see a process by which the left can influence the culture at a very, very deep level and in a very, very fast level, such that they're essentially changing the standards by which they're judged on. They're controlling the narrative that's told after the political reality happens, in which they can recast, and naturally will recast, political mistakes and political problems, such as the sexual revolution and the dissolution of the black family, as actually just happenstance, which they are then able to come in and correct. Thus, since they control both the standard they're judged by and also the policies they put forward, they have this core anti-fragility where even political setbacks are just opportunities for their own expansion. And thus, in their competitions with other conservative parties, they are practically unassailable, since their victories are opportunities and also their losses are further opportunities. Since they can edit the standards under which they are judged, no political consequences can ever befall them. Alright, so now I think we're sort of left with a question that's more or less inevitable in this discussion, which is largely what can people or movements who are trying to oppose the progressive cause really do about their stranglehold on culture and their ability to introduce new cultural standards into the consciousness of society? Well, in short, I think this comes down to trying to slow the three mechanisms I described, the three mechanisms by which progressives try to influence core cultural institutions. That is, the language, identity formation, and historical narrative. However, there's a very, very good objection to this, and that is that the attempt to slow down progressive influence on these things has been a major project of the conservative movements of the past, and they have across the board failed to do so. At best, they've been able to slow down the process by which progressives can edit the cultural standards. And there's been a growing sense in our society that really the protections we had put on core cultural norms, like language and history, are just never going to come back, and these will ultimately and perpetually be political entities. As such, any attempt to slow down the progressive influence on them is really not going to work. Now, of course, I'm sure at this point, any viewers who are still watching will probably have noticed an alternative solution to slowing down the progressive influence on core cultural institutions. And this is the very logical alternative of simply trying to influence those said core cultural components through politicized cultural means, just like the progressive movement has done. And this sort of fight fire with fire attitude is obviously very tempting and understandable. We know that the left has been successful at this, so why not a counter movement to do the same thing? Well, the problem is with this particular thought is it's not really something that will lead to any kind of societal cohesion. One party can politicize culture and try to move it, but as soon as you've got two forces that try to politicize culture in two very, very different directions, what you get is not some kind of truce, but rather two subcultures forming up inside of a crumbling superstructure. As such, these two new cultures will become increasingly oppositional until the exterior society simply falls apart, and society breaks apart into balkanized subcultures. So this is really not a recipe to get back into sort of an equalist framework where both sides in a controlled political environment have a debate in a setting where they both respect each other's rights. This is just a recipe for a civil war and the dissolution of a unified society altogether. And to a large degree, I see the forces that oppose progressivism, regardless of the consequences, are going to increasingly encourage just this, the formation of new cultures that are oppositional to the mainstream and oppositional to progressivism. And as such, mainstream society will slowly begin to crumble because there's nothing common holding it up. I guess the one hope is that in the process of this balkanization, other intellectuals on the progressive side will realize what's going on and try to re-embrace institutions that lead to some kind of normality. But again, I'm quite skeptical because we've already seen two major forces that are not progressive really understand the mechanisms by which you can create lasting subcultures that feed into the framework by which politics is judged. We see this in the Salafist Islamist movements across the West, and we see this in the alt-right and neo-fascists. But I think that is a story for another day. Have a great night.